He who ruled scent ruled the hearts of men. Love can be learned too. One of the significant points of the book is how language can be used to exploit people and manipulate them. It was a really well-written book. Give me a prejudice and I will move the world. So I've decided to try to read 5 books in 5 days, and I just finished a pretty long, challenging book, so I figured something more concise would be good before I delve into another long book. And so I picked out 5 that I've been meaning to read, 2 of which I've actually read before, but I've kind of forgotten about. The 5 books that I picked out in no particular order include The Eye by Vladimir Nabokov, and I've never read any of his works before, but I do have other books by him, so I figured this would be a good start, and who knows, I might end up liking it. And it's described as a satirical detective story, and it explores topics of identity, appearance, and the loss of a self in a world of wordplay and confusion. And that just sounds pretty interesting to me, so I am looking forward to this. The next book is Perfume by Patrick Süskind, and it's a story of a murderer, and I believe he's in search of a particular scent. And so he just kills a bunch of people in the hopes of finding that scent. The premise seems interesting, so I figured, or I've been wanting to read it. The next book is At the Mountains of Madness by H.P. Lovecraft. And this book, I believe, is horror fiction, which is a genre I'm not familiar with. It's about an expedition to Antarctica that goes horribly wrong when the explorers stumble upon some ancient ruins, unearthing a lost alien civilization and unleashing monstrous forces they cannot hope to control. That just sounds so cool. I did read a bit about the author. There's a little blurb in the first page, and it's kind of sad. Apparently he died in 1937, and he died in poverty and virtually unknown. So his works became famous after his death, which is always sad to hear, honestly, that he wasn't there to live and see the effects that his works have had on people. The next book is Animal Farm by George Orwell, and this is the illustrated version. I don't know, it's really pretty. The cover is pretty, and the drawings are pretty too. But I read this a while ago, I think in middle school or something, and I remember liking it. But now when I try to recall what the story was about, I can't really remember. I just know that it's about a bunch of animals, so I figured I should reread it. The next book I read is also a book I read for school, and it's Chronicle of a Death Foretold by Gabriel, Garcia, Marquez. And I read this in high school, and I really, really liked it. This was my introduction to magical realism, which is a genre that I never even knew existed. I just thought it was so cool that there was something in between realistic fiction and fantasy. Like, there's definitely magical elements, but not in the sense of like actual magic or like monsters. It's just very subtle. So basically, in this story, we follow a man, and it's just as the title says, his death is foretold. And from the very beginning, you know that this guy is going to die. But the sequence of events that lead up to his death are just baffling. There's so many instances where his death could have been prevented, but it wasn't for some reason, be it fate or destiny. So these are the 5 books that I'm going to be reading, and I'm excited. Hopefully I actually read all of them. But yeah, I think I'll start with At the Mountains of Madness. Human beings have a seemingly innate need to form an explanation for everything. and that could very well one day be the cause of our downfall. Because how can we know that we're better off not knowing without actually knowing the subject in question? Last night I finished reading At the Mountains of Madness by H.P. Lovecraft. I read a bit in the morning and then I finished it off in the evening, and I really enjoyed this. The thing this book did really well was build suspense, and it does that from the very first line. I am forced into speech because men of science have refused to follow my advice without knowing why. So you know that this man would prefer not to speak on this matter at all, for mankind to take his advice without justification, but he also knows the nature of beings and how that could never be. And so against his desires and perhaps his better judgment, he writes this account of the expedition and what they had found. I honestly found the writing and the story in general to be very unsettling, and it did scare me. And as I've mentioned before, I don't have much experience reading horror, but this was a really nice introduction to that genre. The one thing I will say is that the story is very descriptive, and I can see how this could cause people to prematurely end the book. But I do think it's important to keep in mind that those descriptions were necessary. The writer of the account, Dr. Dyer, is a scientist, and he is recounting these events in order to dissuade the scientific community from further exploring Antarctica. And so it makes sense for him to go into the minutest details while talking about the expedition. So when looking at it that way, those descriptions were really necessary, and I do believe made the overall book more realistic, and they did contribute to the overall creepy atmosphere. Also, when descriptions are so vivid as they were in this book, I'm kind of left in awe of the writer, because they want the reader to see what they're seeing when they produce those words. The writers obviously have a very clear image of what is going on in their story, and they want as best as they can to convey that to the reader. So that's just kind of incredible and kind of cool in my opinion. I do think it's a really good story to read in only a day, because I feel as though if I would have read it over multiple days, I wouldn't have felt as much suspense as I did by essentially reading it all at once. With that being said, I'm ready to start my next book, which will be Animal Farm. So I know I technically read this book before, but I basically forgot all of the characters. But I came across one that I think is going to be a favorite of mine. So I'll just read a little excerpt that made me laugh. Benjamin was the oldest animal on the farm, and the worst tempered. He seldom talked, and when he did, it was usually to make some cynical remark. For instance, he would say that God had given him a tail to keep the flies off, but that he would sooner have had no tail and no flies. So yesterday I finished reading Animal Farm, and it was really interesting because all I'd remembered is the very last line. And so it was sort of like reading it for the first time, a second time. The first few pages were like super lighthearted, but then towards the end I was just angry. And I was taken aback by that because I wasn't expecting that reaction. Without any spoilers, Animal Farm explores socialist ideals and some of the problems that you run into when trying to implement those ideals. So basically the story is about a farm, and these animals within the farm overthrow the human being that was like in charge of them. you basically see how various different jobs are allocated to the different animals, and you see the establishment of these commandments, these rules that the animals live or are supposed to live by. But slowly, as several members of the animal farm crave more power and money, those commandments begin to change, and they change in a really interesting way. One of the significant points of the book is how language can be used to exploit people and manipulate them. And it does so while making people believe that the way things are is what they want, and the way things are is the right way to do things. It was sad to see the animals put so much faith in those in power, and to just have them be exploited in the end. And like, for what? They basically got nothing in return for how hard they were working. The next book I'll read is Perfume, and I do believe this also falls under the horror genre. So yesterday night I finished Perfume, and I'm mad at myself for waiting this long to read this book because I absolutely loved it and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And the ending has given me a lot to think about. I feel like an ending for me can make or break a book, and this ending was definitely memorable, and I'm definitely going to be thinking about it for days or weeks from now. The book discusses a wide array of topics. You get morality, love and hatred, passion, but at the core of it is the sense of smell and how important sense of smell is. And it's something that the main character argues guides the behavior of a lot of human beings, but they're unaware of the effect that it has on them. I felt like having the sense of smell as a central point in the book was really interesting because it's not something that's usually spoken of or depicted in many forms of media. And it could be because it's difficult, but also because it's not something that we see. So perhaps we give it less importance than it actually has in our everyday lives. Something I didn't expect was for the book to be so funny. It does have a lot of dark humor. I expected it to be very dark throughout, but it was very lighthearted for what the topic is, which I actually enjoyed. So I wanted to read an excerpt. For people could close their eyes to greatness, to horrors, to beauty, and their ears to melodies or deceiving words, but they could not escape scent, for scent was a brother of breath. Together with breath it entered human beings, who could not defend themselves against it, not if they wanted to live. And scent entered into their very core, went directly to their hearts, and decided for good and all between, affection and contempt, disgust and lust, love and hate. He who ruled scent ruled the hearts of men. Yeah. In conclusion, I really enjoyed this book, and I'm really glad that I got around to reading it finally. The next book I'm reading is The Eye by Vladimir Nabokov, and I'm excited for this, and I really hope I enjoy it. Yesterday I finished The Eye, and it was a really well-written book. The writing was just beautiful, and it was also really thought-provoking. I would say if someone wanted to pick this book up, they should not read the synopsis or read any reviews and just get started with it, because it could spoil a big part of the story. and I feel like it's better if you figure it out yourself. I think the only thing you need to know going in is that the topics it discusses are a suicide and identity. For a small part of the book, I was a little confused, but I still very much enjoyed the writing, even in those moments where I was like, what's going on here? And I feel like if you're like me and you've never read any of Vladimir Nabokov's books before, this would be a good starting point because it's so short and you could quickly gauge whether or not you like it and whether or not you'll be wanting to read more of his works. Like, this solidified to me that I am for sure going to be reading more of his works. The thing I really liked is the ways in which he describes things. And so I picked out a little excerpt that I really liked. I thought it was really well written. And this won't ruin the story in any way. None could discern in him the shyness that makes a person so conspicuous among people who know each other well and are bound together by the established echoes of private jokes and by an elusive residue of people's names that to them are alive with special significance, making the newcomer feel as if the magazine story he has started to read had really begun long ago, in old, unobtainable issues. And as he listens to the general conversation, rife with references to incidents unknown to him, the outsider keeps silent and shifts his gaze to whoever is speaking. And the quicker the exchanges, the more mobile become his eyes. But soon, the invisible world that lives in the words of the people around him begins to oppress him. And he wonders if they have not deliberately contrived a conversation to which he is a stranger. So, yeah, that was one example of the writing. But it's stuff like that. Like, those are emotions that I've experienced before. But to see them written in such a way, I don't know, I just really enjoyed his descriptions and the writing. I also really liked the discussion revolving identity, and I felt like it was really, really interesting. The last book I'll be reading is Chronicle of a Death Foretold by Gabrielle Garcia Marquez. So yesterday I finished reading Chronicle of a Death Foretold, and wow, what an incredible story, incredible writing, and incredible characters. So this story follows the murder of Santiago Nassar, and it's told from the point of view of this man who returns to the town where the murder took place 27 years later, and he's asking all of these various people about like what had actually happened that day, because it seems as though this murder should have not taken place, and yet it did. So it raises the question of, like, was this destiny? Was he fated to die that day, regardless of what anyone could have done? Or could his murder have been prevented? I really enjoyed the portrayal of collectivist societies. It really shows you that there's like a sense of togetherness that's really nice and a sense of community, but it doesn't come without its downsides because people place more of an importance on the way they appear to those around them. Also, within these types of communities, your actions don't just reflect on yourself alone. They reflect on your family and those around you as well. The writing here is beautiful and the lines are so memorable. For example, at one point, this mother is talking about her daughters and she's like, they were perfect. Any man would be happy with them because they were raised to suffer. Also, give me a prejudice and I will move the world. Also, I really enjoyed or related to the discussions on marriage, just because these are things that I've heard also growing up. So, for example, one quote is, Angela Vicario only dared hint at the inconvenience of a lack of love, but her mother demolished it with a single phrase. Love can be learned too. Also, as a side note, Angela Vicario, I think, is one of my favorite characters ever. Just really liked her, and I really liked reading about her. But I highly recommend this book. So with that, I end the challenge. Technically, I did fail because Perfume took me 2 days to read instead of 1 like the others. But still, I am really glad that I did this, honestly. I don't think I would have done this if it wasn't in the form of a challenge, but I had more free time than usual, and so I'm really glad I spent it like this. Also, all of the books were so different from one another, so it was a lot of fun reading such a wide range of fiction.